Hey guys, today I have a special guest, Shawn Smith. He is the writer of this new book called Gatekeeper, and he's on today, and we're going to talk about Gatekeeper and what it is, what the whole concept is, and why you should read the book. But I want to introduce Shawn to you. He's somebody that I've known over the last couple of years, probably one of the guys that has spoken in my life and given me a lot of concepts and ideas around the idea of masculinity and what it means to be masculine. So, Shawn, I just really appreciate you being here today. Thanks,
Well,
man.
thanks, man. I appreciate that. That's quite an introduction. I'll try to live up to it.
Let's just start with this book, Gatekeeper. Now, this isn't the first book that you've written.
No, it's not even the first book that I've read, but yeah, it's not the first one I've written. This is a follow-on to the Tactical Guide to Women, which a few guys have read. And this is a little more that, whereas that book was looking at what is she bringing to the relationship? What are the minimum requirements? What makes what makes a woman minimally competent to participate in a romantic commitment? That's what the Tactical Guide to Women is about. This is more about you, the reader. This is what are you bringing into the relationship, and particularly what kind of patterns are you repeating? So I'm starting to get some feedback from younger guys. Two groups of guys, younger guys, we'll say like 25, starting out on thinking about seriously about commitment. And so they're looking at the patterns that they're bringing into it. And then older guys who might be starting over 45, 50, 60, who are reading this and they're realizing that they have some patterns that they're not wanting to repeat if they start over.
What are some of these patterns that you've recognized or they've expressed in some way?
Well, it's kind of a difficult thing to pin down because, and I think I do a reasonably good job in the book, because where I start is, I should walk that back. Who am I to say how awesome the book is, right?
But you wrote it, so why not? Yeah.
The way I start in the book is I talk about 5 qualities that, in my estimation, as somebody who's been a clinical psychologist for 16, 17 years now in private practice, the things that a guy should look for in a relationship, which is not necessarily the same as what you should look for in her, because the relationship and her are kind of two different entities. I don't get too esoteric about that in the book, but there are some qualities that this commitment, this relationship, if you're going to commit to a woman, it should bring some things in your life. It should add to your life. And in my estimation, those things should bring composure rather than chaos. It should bring dignity rather than shame. It should bring resilience rather than weakness. It should bring some qualities like that, joy rather than fatigue. Because if you see a guy who's in a joyless relationship, like the life is just sucked out of me, he just looks exhausted and tired. So I use that as a starting point. And then I explore, okay, well, what is it that leads a guy into a relationship that brings chaos rather than composure? And so there's some topics to talk about regarding history, guys coming up through chaotic families, or other things that lead guys to take on chaos rather than looking for relationships that are more composed. And that's sort of how I approach it, right? And I end up with each chapter, it ends up with a sampling of ways of approaching relationships. I call them organizing principles in the book, but ways of approaching relationships that replicate what it is that you're familiar with, whether it's chaos or shame or just misery, or the good stuff too. Because some of us grow up and we usually grow up in, almost everybody grows up in some type of a mixed bag where you get good experiences and bad. And you want to hang on to the good patterns, and you probably want to jettison the bad ones.
When it comes to chaos and composure, that sounds like there's a polarity, the masculine and feminine polarity at play there. I don't know what your take is on masculine, feminine polarity, or if you have a take on it, but if a guy is trying to seek composure, which oftentimes I think composure is about comfort, and the feminine oftentimes is bringing chaos into the relationship, that he's kind of fighting an uphill battle sometimes. When you say chaos versus composure, are you talking about that kind of polarity, or are you talking about something else?
I'm talking well, yes, both. Okay. Part of it is that masculine and feminine. I don't get too much into that because that's a topic that I'm not real good at talking about. But there is the feminine chaos that there's a little bit of chaos that women can bring into our lives. And it's not a bad word, like a roller coaster.
Right.
A roller coaster is chaotic, right?
Yeah,
but it's
exactly.
chaotic within a bounds. It doesn't
Right.
kill you. It doesn't, you get off of that chaos and you feel good, hopefully.
Right.
You feel energized. And a hurricane is unbounded
Right.
chaos. You don't want to
Yeah.
experience that. So I just touch on the fact that, sometimes we as men need someone to pull us out of our routine, because a lot of us can get really focused on our mission and our purpose to the point where we start getting blinders. We stop taking care of ourselves. We start having stop having a well-rounded life. And productive chaos can bring some of that back to us if you have an appetite for it. Destructive chaos, just stuff like alcohol abuse and fights and family drama and gossip and mayhem and shenanigans. Like, that's the kind of stuff that pulls you off of your purpose. And there are so many guys who are drawn to that for any number of reasons. And probably the biggest reason is just familiarity. It's what I know. So I understand chaotic women. So I will attract chaotic women because I know how to interact with them, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. The familiarity of growing up in a household that's chaotic and being used to that. And I think even kind of on an unconscious level of, we don't know what it is. It just feels familiar. And so we move into that without really knowing or taking a reflective view of what's happening in the relationship. So
there's a whole range of responses to growing up that way. One is that you yourself just become a chaotic person. You're the one that's, your job's a mess, your life's a mess, everything's a mess in your world. Or you become the kid that holds everything together. Yeah. And then if you're the kid that has to be a parent to your parents and has to make sure that your little siblings are fed and so forth, and you're not careful, well, guess what kind of romantic relationship you're going to be drawn to?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, probably one where you're a caretaker.
Yeah. I've seen it happen. And so have you.
That's true. Yeah. So tell me about the name Gatekeeper.
I explained that in the introduction of the book. There was a researcher named Angus John Bateman back in the 50s, I think. And he was working with fruit flies. And he noticed this behavior in male and female fruit flies because he was studying their mating behavior. And he noticed what you would expect, that the male fruit flies, they don't care who they bang in terms of female fruit flies. The female fruit flies are more selective. And so I think he used that term gatekeeper to describe female fruit flies being the gatekeepers of sex. And that has, I can't draw a straight line, but I'm fairly certain that research is what led to what we hear in the popular discourse today, that men are the gatekeepers of relationships and women are the gatekeepers of sex, which is not a perfect ideology because not a perfect idea, because women also care about sex and men also care about relationships. But it's also not a bad way to think about the way we as humans go about relationships. It is men who tend to preserve their options and women who tend to preserve their chastity, because that's where the risk lies to each of us. That women run a greater risk when they get pregnant. We run a greater risk, genetically speaking, when we foreclose other options. And so the reason I chose the title Gatekeeper is because I look around and I look at the kind of relationships that so many guys are choosing. And some guys do really well. They're very thoughtful about the relationships. Some guys just repeat the patterns that they grew up around, and they do okay. They luck out, and then other guys are just not very intentional. There's no evidence that so many men out there are not being the gatekeeper to the relationship, which means they're not being the gatekeeper to themselves. They're not being the gatekeeper to their future. They're not protecting their future finances. They're not protecting their future children. They're not protecting their future family. So the gatekeeper, I wanted that imagery of somebody who is a man who is actually selective about the women that come into his life. Because so many of us have this mindset that either I need to take what I can get, or I don't really care, I will take what I can get. But we need to be selective. There's too much on the line.
I've had a couple of guys kind of ask me this question that have read the book, where they've been in relationships for a while. Maybe they've been married for 10, 15 years or something like that. And they find themselves in a relationship that's less than satisfying, gratifying, what do you say to those guys? What should they do when it's like they've let too much, they haven't done a good job at gatekeeping? What do they do? Do they just need to just, cut bait, start over, or are there things that they could
Yeah.
do in their relationship?
Well, any guy that came into my office with that concern, which is actually fairly frequently, I'd want to clearly define the problem. What is it exactly what we're talking about? But if it's what you're talking about, which you just mentioned, where they've allowed too much chaos into their life in particular, and they're trying to clean that up, that's a tough one. I mean, it can be done, but
Yeah.
once you spend 10, 15 years training people that this is what you're going to accept, it's a lot of work. It's not impossible, but it's a lot of work to retrain them and raise your standards for acceptable behavior in your world. It can be done, but man, it takes some backbone.
Right. Yeah. It's trying to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak.
Like governments, if a government imposes a tax for a turnpike, they don't eliminate the tax once the turnpike is done, and so to get rid of that tax is a monumental undertaking. And that's sort of what you're facing if you've allowed too much chaos in your life.
And guys that aren't in that situation, what can they do to sort of ensure that they don't do that? How can they be good gatekeepers?
The first and well, a couple of solid guidelines here is one that I talk about quite a bit, both in the Tactical Guide to Women and Gatekeeper, is don't slide into commitments. Meaning, unless you have a plan to get married, have children, and so forth, she doesn't need to be living in your house. You don't need to be paying her rent. You don't need to be fixing her car. She doesn't need her tampons under your sink. Like, keep the boundaries. Don't slide your way into these commitments, because there are a lot of people, and this has actually been studied, there are a lot of people who find themselves at the altar because they moved in together, basically. And that's their reason for continuing to go forward. So that's one. But the other, and this is, every human being owes this to themselves, is to study your own patterns. Just know how it is that you approach relationships.
Right. Yeah. 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 You mentioned something to me a while back in a conversation, and I thought it was really brilliant. You talked about, like, know where you're at in the relationship. In other words, if you just met somebody, you're not dating. And if you're dating somebody, you're not engaged. And if you're engaged, you're not married. Like, knowing where you're at in the arc of the relationship is really important, because, and I think especially for guys that have been married for a while, this was something that happened to me, at least, was I'd been married for, 19 years, all of a sudden back in the dating pool. And what I wanted was the comfort of that familiar feeling of just having somebody around. And so it was really easy to kind of jump into a relationship with someone without really doing the work on myself, because I just wanted that familiar feeling back. I wanted that sense of safety and commitment and all of that. So
yeah, it's really easy to slide in. And there are those categories of women, and women have the same categories for men. There's acquaintance, there's prospect, there's girlfriend, there's fiance, and there's wife or equivalent. But these categories, they have existed throughout time, as far as we know, in human relationships, like the word courtship goes back a long ways. And courtship refers to being thoughtful about going to the next level with someone.
Yeah. Really taking some time to figure out if you have compatibility, if you have similar values. I think that's a big one. Yeah.
It's a very big one.
Yeah.
I talk quite a bit about that, actually, in both of those, probably more in Gatekeeper, about being really clear on what your values are and making sure that she fits with your values. Because this is another thing I've seen quite a bit in my practice. And you chime in if you've seen it too, but you have two wonderful people who got married. They've got great character, but their values are different, meaning they have different concepts of what money is for. They have different concepts of how to raise children. They went into the marriage with different ideas about who was going to be the breadwinner and who was going to sacrifice their career to raise the kids or whatever. These are values that need to be worked out before you make the commitment.
Yeah, because I think if you don't work those out, one or two things is going to happen. You're going to grow with resentments until, the relationship basically, falls apart, or you're going to get sucked into just kind of the quiet resignation of this is what I have to do.
Yes, dear.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and neither one of those is a very pleasant option.
No, no. And the yes, dear relationships, both of those people are resentful. The guy who's saying yes, dear all the time, he resents his woman, and his woman resents him for not having a backbone.
Right. Right.
You know, I've seen a couple cases where the woman came in and she sacrificed more than she thought she was going to sacrifice, or more than she intended to sacrifice in terms of career. And this is a big issue in modern America because career is important to women. And so if a woman comes in and she thinks that she's going to be free to blossom in her career, and you think that you're going to be free to blossom in your career, and there's kids involved, well, somebody's going to have to start making cuts and sacrifices. And women oftentimes have this nature where they will just start to be accommodating, and they'll start making the cuts, and they'll be quiet about it. And the guy will accept it because he doesn't want to, you know, he kind of likes what's happening. So he won't challenge her on it. And then one day she is just beyond resentful. She can't stand the guy anymore because she's looking back at what she considers to be wasted years. And you know, these are conversations that are pretty easy to have early in the relationship.
Right. Right. Yeah. A bit of a microcosm of that. I remember my first marriage when we first got married. In my household growing up, my mom, she pretty much took care of the house. And so things like taking the garbage out was the one where she would always take the garbage out. And my wife, it was the exact opposite. She grew up in a house where her dad always took the garbage out. He was the one that took the garbage out, wheeled it out in the corner, you know, set it there. And so for, you know, the first few months of our marriage, we were sitting there in total squalor because neither one of us was taking out the garbage because we were expecting, you know, the other to do it. I think that's what happens on a grander scale, is that what you're used to or what your value is and what your partner's value is and what they're used to, if those aren't well defined, if they're not talked about, then you end up sort of expecting things to be like they were when you were growing up. Is there a central point that you think would be really important for guys who are about to read the book of what you're trying to communicate here?
Yeah, I think the central point would be that there are things you should expect from the relationship. You know, just some basic things. Now you can go beyond that and you can expect more, but there are some basic requirements that you as a man should expect from any kind of romantic commitment, because male commitment is an incredibly valuable commodity, because you're saying to a woman, I'm going to foreclose all my other opportunities. I'm going to pay attention to you. You get my time, you get my attention, you get my problem solving abilities, you get my money making abilities. And there are so many men out there who don't ask for anything in return to that. And so it's time for a lot of guys to think about, okay, maybe I should be getting something in return for this commodity that I'm offering somebody. So there's number one, is you can ask for things in return. You're not here to be somebody else's servant. That's number one. But then number two is knowing your patterns, understanding, I keep using that word, but understanding what you learned about male-female interactions from watching your parents, from interacting with your parents, from interacting with teachers, from interacting with girls in school. You know, what have you picked up along the way? And what does it predispose? What kind of relationship does it predispose you to? Does it predispose you to a relationship that leaves you better off, or does it predispose you to a relationship where you're going to be taken advantage of? You're going to get used. You're going to be disregarded. You're going to be unhappy. You're not going to get laid enough, you know, which comes back to you're allowed to have some expectations in return for your commitment.
How important is it to communicate those expectations? Or do you just assume that these expectations would be met?
Well, so we'll get into kind of my personal opinion here, because a lot of the book is not, I give a little bit of my personal opinion, but it's mostly what I've noticed in research. I try to stick pretty close to what I've seen happening in the world. But my personal opinion is that these requirements that I'm talking about, composure, dignity, resilience, joy, and there's love also, but I put that to the end because men put too much emphasis on love. We can talk about that what I mean by that if you want. But these requirements are things that, in my estimation, a guy should be watching for. They're not things that you can really ask for. You can't ask a person, you can't ask a woman to say, hey, can you be less chaotic? I think that the trick is to take the time to actually watch her in real world situations and see if she is somebody who brings a lot of chaos to her relationships. And if she is, well, then she's probably maybe not the best commit, or maybe not the best option for you. And maybe she's a better fit for someone else. Who knows? But
Yeah. 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 So a guy should really focus on knowing himself, knowing what his values are, what he's looking for.
Mhm.
And then when he's in a relationship, it's early on in the relationship, and maybe he sees a lot more chaos. And so he has to ask himself whether or not he can live with that long term. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, observing and
Observing.
chaos. I keep using the word chaos because it's such a
Yeah.
common one, and guys have such a complicated relationship to chaos because, okay, let's say you have a woman she's got a lot of conflict at work, and she's got a lot of conflict with family and so forth. And so there's always something going on with it. There's always some kind of problem to solve. Some guys are going to be repulsed by that. Some guys are really going to groove on that because it scratches an itch for them, because then they get to step into some kind of role with that woman. And that's where you have to know where it is that you're coming from. What's your appetite for chaos, and what's your experience with chaos, and what are you replicating in your world?
Consciously knowing that this is something that feels familiar to me, and this is actually something I want in my life, as opposed to this doesn't feel good. I need to, set a boundary or exit from the relationship before it gets too far down the road.
Or this feels really good, but it has brought me so much pain in the past that maybe I need to be making some different choices.
I think that's the thing I see with a lot of the guys that I work with, is that they get into relationships where their finances are intertwined, and they've got kids, and they've got, a mortgage, and the lifestyle depends on two incomes. And it's too hard to untangle all of that. And so they end up staying in marriages and relationships that aren't really that fulfilling for them.
Cheaper to keep her. That's what they say.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. This is a call to the guys who are maybe not in that long-term committed relationship yet, first to be able to really understand what it is that they're looking for, what they want in a partner, and to be discriminating when you're in that role of dating, so that when you get into that role of long-term partner marriage, you're not finding yourself in that situation where you've got all of this entanglement and it's too hard to leave.
Yeah. Discriminating is an interesting word. I like the word, and I use the word.
Yeah.
It has taken on a negative meaning over the years because I guess it's sort of suggests that you're being unfair, you're unfairly judging somebody, but really it's a word with a positive valence. I think you have discriminating tastes in wine or in cars or whatever. So yeah, discriminating, it's a good word.
So let's circle back, because you mentioned that you had to take on guys and love and putting too much emphasis on the love. What's your take on that?
My take on that is, well, there's some pretty compelling research that suggests that men are quicker to get possessive about a woman than they are about us. They're the first ones to say, I love you. They're the first ones that we feel attached more quickly than they do romantically. And then we kind of do this flip on women where we get real attached at first, and then when they start to get attached to us, then we start to back off. But that's a separate topic. My point is in the book is that number one, we are quicker to get attached than they are, which means that we're rushing past some things that we should be thinking about in terms of our patterns, what we're replicating, what we're inviting into our life sometimes. And number two, we get all this messaging from society that love is all you need. How many songs are there that say love is all you need? Love will heal you. Love will make you a better man.
Yeah.
And we get this messaging, and I think most guys are sort of take it with a grain of salt, but it's still there that love is enough to maintain a relationship. And it's not. These other things need to be in place first. You need to have composure, dignity, resilience, joy. And then you can take love into account. But if the values aren't aligned, love doesn't matter. If her character sucks, love doesn't matter. If the relationship is making you miserable, love doesn't matter. But how many guys have you met and have I met that get just entrenched in a relationship because they are so emotionally attached to a woman? And, it's sweet. It's nice that there are guys out there that can get that committed to somebody, But watching a guy wreck his life over this emotion it's so hard
Yeah.
to watch.
I see that a lot. The guys that I work with, I'm sure you do as well, where they're just this, what's that blindedness, that
Yeah.
infatuation period where you can't see the red flags. Your buddies can all see them. Their buddies are all like, hey, what are you doing? And the guy that's
Yeah, and
infatuated.
exactly. He doesn't have an answer for it. And
Yeah.
that's fair. I don't know. If you ask a guy, why are you wasting your life on this woman? And he says, I don't know. That's a fair answer.
Yeah.
That's a place you can start from. And in this chapter on love, I talk about what are some patterns that makes a guy vulnerable to committing himself to somebody just because he feels like it. Like, why is he willing to? But some reasons are he's been learned that his values are not that important. They can be set aside. He grew up in a marriage where people just stay. He grew up around people who stayed together no matter how miserable they were, which is not great for kids. A healthy divorce is better than a miserable marriage a lot of time for kids. Those sorts of things. And if you don't know why it is that you devote yourself to women just because you love them, quote unquote, or I don't need to put the quotes, you love them. And so you stay attached to women who are hurting you. Okay. That's a good place to start if you can admit that that's what's going on.
And then what do you do?
Then you start digging into, okay, what's my history? How you start asking the question, how did I come to this place? First of all, what am I doing? Being real specific. What am I doing? I'm devoting myself to a woman who's making me miserable. That's a start, but let's get much more specific about it. How exactly is she making your life miserable? What is it that you are inviting into your life specifically? Like, is it that she's an alcoholic? Maybe you grew up around alcoholics and that's what you knew. So then that becomes something that you dig into. Or maybe you just have a real weakness for curvaceous blondes. Maybe it just comes down to biology. Okay, well then let's get a handle on that. Let's identify that is the problem so that going forward, your emotional mind is going to push you toward curvaceous blondes, even if it's against your rational mind's better judgment. And once you know that that's going on, then you get some options around it. You get some freedom that you didn't have when you didn't really know that that's what was going on, if that makes sense.
Do you think that men sometimes fall in love quickly because they just want sex? Or is it because they want something more than that?
I think evolutionary psychology, and I'm prefacing this by saying I think, because I'm thinking back to what I've read and no specifics are coming to mind. But my recollection of evolutionary psychology is that we have this motive as men to lock down a woman, pass on our genes. And so we want to do that pretty quickly.
The idea of jumping into love quickly oftentimes comes from this impulse to lock her down so that we have a genetic resource to extend our genes into the future.
Right. And to be more specific about it, it compels us by way of neurochemistry and by way of behaviors that are built into us as men that we're predisposed to, so that we have this chemical reaction to a woman, basically. And that's what's compelling us forward. Don't move as fast as your hormones are telling you to move. That gives your prefrontal cortex an opportunity to get involved.
A neurochemical reaction to that attraction. It's an impulsive thing that comes from that lizard brain. And then you end up, going deeper in the relationship than maybe you ever intended to.
Yeah. And what you just said, going deeper than you intended to, but also scaring people away. I don't talk much in the book about pickup. That's not really what I do. I think there are some good pickup artists out there that I think do fine work, and some of them that are really slimy and manipulative. But the first sentence in the book says this isn't about picking up women. This is about something different. But if you want to turn women on, like if you want to really attract a woman's attention, just be calm and cool. Don't be in a rush. Like be the one who puts on the brakes, and you may be the first man she's ever encountered that has done that. That is saying, I don't know. Let's slow down and think about this.
Has this impacted you in your relationship?
That's an interesting question. Let me think about that. I think, well, writing it certainly has, because writing it, I was really, 2 years, I was really thinking about relationship patterns. And I was thinking
Yeah.
about relationship patterns going into relationships. But of course, you can't think about that for 2 years. I've thought about it for a lot more than 2 years, but you can't think
Yeah.
about that and not notice the things you're doing in your relationship, or the things that my wife is doing in the relationship. And she and I didn't talk too much about the book. She likes the book. She's
Hmm.
really behind the book, and she thinks it's a great book. But um, I don't know that we haven't had a lot of conversations about it. But certainly, I do think about how I ended up where I am in
Hmm.
this relationship, and part of it was luck. Part of it
Yeah.
was an instinct that I didn't want to repeat a
Hmm.
lot of what I grew up around, and so I got to a point, some point in my 20s, where I realized that I needed to pick a different kind of woman. And I didn't have,
Mm.
I'm in my 20s. I didn't have any words for
Yeah.
this. I was an idiot. I was
Right.
a bonehead. But
Right.
I had the sense to realize that what I was doing was working very poorly in most cases.
Yeah.
And I needed to pick the opposite of what I grew up around. That was enough that I sort of lucked into a really great woman.
Hmm.
And so this is my understanding of things is much deeper than it used to be, because when you're in your 20s,
Yeah.
most guys don't have a lot of words for this stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. They're just going on a feeling. They're going on what they're seeing their friends do.
Mhm.
I was just talking about this with somebody today. I think when you're in your 20s, especially like in your later 20s and maybe even early 30s, you start to realize that time goes a lot faster than it did when you were a kid. And there
Yeah.
becomes sort of this existential crisis of, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And you see your other friends and they're getting married or they're getting engaged or they're having babies or buying houses or any of these number of things. And I remember being in my 20s and feeling like that and feeling like, all these things were passing me by. I think a lot of times guys that are in their 20s and they're in that situation don't really think a lot about the impact that this relationship's going to have on them long term. And you point out in the Tactical Guide to Women that it's who you choose to spend your life with is probably the biggest financial decision you'll ever make,
Mhm.
and at least have the most impact on your finances. And I
It can
think a
affect
lot
how
of
long you live.
how long you live, your quality of life. But when you're 25, you're just like, oh, she's pretty. She'll have sex with me. Let's
Yeah.
get married.
Yeah. That's the
That's what
standards
people do.
for most guys, is that she's good enough looking and she's not particularly annoying. Like, that's a pretty
Yeah.
low standard. We can do
Yeah.
better than that.
I like your point too, that I think a lot of men don't realize what it is that they bring into the relationship in terms of the stability that as a man you bring in a lot to the relationship, and it's okay for you to have needs and want some things in return. That's the whole point of reciprocity, is that there's this give and take.
Yeah. And guys, boys these days so many of them are growing up around terms like toxic masculinity, and
Yeah.
they're getting the message that you are a piece of crap because you're a man. You're
Right.
you're vicious. You're a threat. You need to be constrained. You need to be shamed into compliance. And it's
Mhm.
some kids are not growing up around that. Depends on your parents and your situation. But so many kids, so many young
Yeah.
boys are growing up around that message. And so, what does that do when you go into a relationship? You've been hearing your whole life that you're a toxic piece of crap. And if you went to
Mhm.
college, if you went to any larger college, it got pounded into your head
Yeah.
to some degree that
Mhm.
you really need to be careful because you are kind of a bad creature.
You're a predator.
Yeah, you're a predator. Yeah. And so if a kid grows up around that messaging, maybe I'm overstating it a bit, but if there's that thread of messaging that goes through his development, well, he's going to bring that into his romantic relationships. And the assumption he's going to make is, well, I guess she's doing me a favor by being with me because
Mhm.
clearly I'm an undesirable. And no,
Mhm.
it's nonsense. The movie Barbie, if you saw the
Oh,
Barbie
I didn't
movie,
see it. No.
it was, yeah. What I took
You
to
have a
my wife and
daughter.
daughter to, yeah, I took my wife and daughter to it, and then I spent 2 hours mansplaining about how it was, how it was off base. But they talk about the patriarchy. The patriarchy over and over and over through that movie. It's the patriarchy that is
Mm.
holding us down. Well, they never define it. They never describe exactly what it is or how it's holding them down. They present this cartoonish view of patriarchy. It's like a frat house, I guess. But
yeah.
so we have this boogeyman called patriarchy. And that's the same thing that goes on in the culture. Feminism will complain about patriarchy, but I've never heard a feminist define patriarchy and be very specific about how this supposed oppressive force is actually holding her back rather than propelling her forward with everything from indoor plumbing to every opportunity she could want at Harvard University, you know. So boys hear these terms like patriarchy and toxic masculinity that are never defined. And the danger to not defining them is that they just then take on this emotional, they just become emotionally sticky, that you're part of the patriarchy, you have toxic masculinity, shame on you.
Yeah. 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 You're part of the problem. Men have been repressing women for centuries, and you're just one of many men who just wants to repress and take away all of their rights. And that's not true. I think for a lot of men that I know, that's not your intention. You intend to lift the feminine up and to celebrate her.
Absolutely. As long as she makes me a sandwich. No.
There you go.
As long as those pots and pans are rattling, I'm okay.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, good to go.
No, the masculine and the feminine go, I mean, obviously we go together, right? And the thing about this feminist ideology that uses terms like patriarchy and toxic masculinity is that most women, in my experience, who call themselves feminists, that's not what they're talking about. They have this very pleasant view of feminism that says men and women should have equal rights and equal responsibilities. And I'm 100% on board with that. It's only really on college campuses and in HR departments and other rings of hell that you get this really ideologically laden feminism that is so poisonous. But it goes out into the world. You know, it starts in colleges and it goes out into the world. It goes to the HR department, and the HR department is inflicting it on employees, and it goes to from the college to the elementary school, where the teachers are inflicting this on children. And that's where guys really hear this message that they're predatory.
They're bad. Yeah.
They're bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Shawn, I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about Gatekeeper. I'm assuming guys can get this pretty much at any bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Anywhere books are sold, as I say.
Anywhere books are sold.
There's even an audiobook.
Shawn, thanks again. And guys, thanks for joining us today. If you have any comments, you want to like, subscribe, share this video to other people, it would be much appreciated in how you can help this YouTube channel grow. And Shawn, thanks again. I appreciate you. Love you as a brother. And we'll see all of you next time.
Thank you, Chuck.